want to start off by asking you about your family history. If you could start by telling me about your grandfather.
Well, my grandfather was born in Escus, and he was educated, as far as I know, in Anikinesh at St. FX. And my father was born in Escus also, and he was educated at Dalhousie. But one of the big achievements of my grandfather was that he formed the French Acadian Association called l'Assomption, and it developed into a major insurance company as it is today. Plus, they have a large development in the city of Moncton, the station and the CNR station, plus a group of stores are involved, and offices, and it's I don't know just what they call it, but it's the original name is l'Assomption, and the insurance company still bears that name.
So how was he involved in the founding of l'Assomption? What was his role?
Well, mind you, it was founded in a suburb of Boston. What was the name of that? Is there a suburb called Salem, outside of Boston? That's where he organized it, with the French Acadians that were living outside of Boston, a suburb of Boston. And it just started in a small way as a small insurance company. And as I say, it grew to quite large proportions. And as a matter of fact, I have an insurance policy with them myself. And most of the Acadians in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia have insurance, life insurance with the l'Assomption. For a matter of fact, in the church of Escus, there's a plaque there in memory of my grandfather, and it was put there some 2 or 3 years ago by the Society of l'Assomption of Moncton.
Is he buried in the schools?
He's buried in Escus in the old graveyard. And I can recall, I would say, that he died at our home in Truro. And my father, in latter years, after he graduated, first of all, my father taught at Church Point. He was principal of the academy. His first assignment was principal of the academy at Church Point, the Point de l'Église. And after that, he was appointed from that post to a professor at the normal school in Truro, Teachers College. He taught there some 30 years. And I can recall, when I was about 7 years of age, my grandfather was visiting our home in Truro, and that's where he died. And I can recall my father saying that his last words were, "Au revoir au Canada," goodbye Canada. His last words on his deathbed.
What were some of the other things that your grandfather was involved in?
Well, mind you, he was customs officer in Arishat for a term, and what was the other? And he was inspector of schools for a term. Well, and that's where my father landed eventually. After teaching the 30 years at the normal school, he was appointed Acadian inspector of schools for Richmond County and Inverness. And he was a special inspector. He was especially appointed because he was an Acadian. And I remember well that he used to try and visit every school twice a year in Inverness and Richmond counties.
So your grandfather was involved in education as well then?
That's correct.
Was he a school teacher?
No, he never taught school. Not to my knowledge.
I've also heard it said that he was that he owned a motel in Ayrshire.
Well, that's true. They called him what, yes, they called it was the old, the people that had it, the last people that owned it were the Thurgoods. It was right next to it's right next to the municipal office, and it's torn down now. And what's that tree that we have as common here? The elm?
The Silver Oak.
Silver Oak. They call it the Silver Oaks. That's the name. That's the name they gave to the hotel. And these Silver Oaks, there was a boat landed in Ayrshire many years ago, and they had these Silver Oaks aboard the boat. And they gave them to my grandfather, and he had them planted here and there around Ayrshire. And there's one thing wrong with them, that they're not, the roots are not deeply seated. And whenever we get a high wind, they're subject to being derooted and fall down. Other than that, they grow well and they grow tall.
So it was your grandfather that originated the Silver Oaks?
That's right, in Ayrshire. And there are a few left. There are some down below here at the shore here, and next to the old Cutler House. There's a lot of them there.
You tell us now, you've already told us a little bit about your father. You could tell us a little bit more about him. He was he was professor in Truro. What did he teach at Truro?
He taught physics. A lot of people thought he would be teaching French, but he taught physics. But mind you, he had a French class, a special class for the French Acadians. And another thing that he did while he was in Truro, the Truro, there weren't any sisters, there are nuns, as you just call them. There weren't any nuns in Truro, and the nuns of the Order of the Sacred Heart, I believe that are they not the ones that operate the outside of Halifax?
Mount St. Vincent?
Mount St. Vincent, isn't it the sisters? You don't know what the order is. Well, however, they asked him to find a large residence so that the girls that were coming to the normal school, the Catholic girls that were coming to the normal school, would have could have a private boarding school house. And he found a large residence on Pleasant Street for them. And the sisters are still operating that home or that residence, and in a boarding house for students going to the normal school in Truro. And of course, he was very active with Truro civic affairs. He was always a member of the VON, Victoria Order of Nurses, and during the Halifax explosion, I remember it so well. As a boy in school, the windows rattled. I was in grade 6, and the windows rattled in the school. And that night, they brought wounded people from Halifax to Truro by train. They brought them by the hundreds. And my father was being active with the VON, and he was at the Truro train station helping the doctors. And I recall that my father said that the doctors had told him that he should have been a doctor. He was such a help to them, in, helping with the wounded people from the Halifax explosion. But they said he missed his vocation. So I don't know if there's anything else at the moment.
What was it like? There couldn't have been many French Acadian Catholic families in Truro.
I'll tell you. I learned to speak French because they spoke French at home, in the house. So out the door it was English, and in the door it was French. And in those days, there were a lot of Cape Brittoners from Isle of Dam that would go to the States to work. And to make connection, you had to stop off in Truro overnight. You couldn't jump, as today you leave one train and take the next and away you go. But they had to stay overnight. And these Acadians all knew about our family, and they'd always come and stay overnight with us. And that's how I got to know so many people from this area before we came here. And by the way, I was the only one of the family of 5 that stayed in Arishat. When he moved from Truro, all the others left.
You tell me about your brothers and the rest of the family?
Yes, well, my oldest brother was a graduate of the Tech College in Halifax as an engineer. And he went to Buffalo, New York, and he married a girl from West Arishat, Captain Dan LeBlanc's daughter, and her name was Bathilde. So after they lived in Buffalo for a couple of years, he moved to New York, and he went into the manufacture of fans. Now he made cylindrical fans. A cylindrical fan can draw more air or blow more air than the blade fan for the size of the hole. And one order that he had was to supply the United Nations building that was bombed here. Was that this year or last year it was bombed? I think it was this year. You remember that incident? Well, he had a contract to change all the fans in that building with cylindrical fans because of greater efficiency, for better ventilation, in other words. And he retired from that. Excuse me. He retired and closed the business as he retired. One thing that made it tough going, he found a tough competition with the GE and Western Electric, and he was only a small company. And that was one reason why he closed up. But mind you, my brother Edouard, they called him Dar, he worked with him at this business of manufacturing the fans. And once a month, they used to cut asbestos, not washers, but gaskets. Once a month, they cut enough asbestos gaskets for a month's supply of fans they'd make. And mind you, 40 years after he started working there, he died of cancer of the lung, and it was due to the asbestos that he inhaled 40 years ago from the cutting of the, he was foreman at the factory, and he was involved and would be in the presence of this operation of cutting the gaskets. And it took 40 years before it was known that the asbestos affected his lungs. And he died from that this year, or last October.
What about the rest of the family?
And the rest, well, that's right. I have a sister that was married to Senator E.J. Terrio of Digby. He was practicing law in Digby, and they were married. They were married in Arishat, by the way. And about 4 years after they were married, he was appointed senator, the Acadian senator for Nova Scotia. And he only lived 6 months to enjoy that position when he died of lung cancer. And my younger sister, she's now living in Halifax. She's married to Ron Demers, and they lived most of their life in Sydney, but she's suffering with arthritis, and she found that she got better medical attention in Halifax, where the specialists are, and she had to travel back and forth so many times that they moved there and they're retired, living at Scotia Square. So that accounts for the fact, and I stayed here.
Can you tell me about moving here? How old were you when?
Well, I was about 20 years old when I moved here. And I discovered that moving and and death and taxes are pretty well alike. We left Truro. In those days the trucks weren't like today's vans. And for a matter of fact, we had the well-known name of Hoyt. Hoyt's transfer, they're still in operation today in Halifax. But they originated in Truro. And he had 2 small trucks. And we were 12 hours, 24 hours. From the time we started loading in Truro, when we got unloaded in Arishat, we were up 24 hours, right around the clock. And when we came off the ferry, or what do you call it? You wouldn't call it the ferry. The boat that crosses from Mulgrave to Hawkesbury, you'd call it the ferry, I imagine. You know, that's before your day, but you know, you had to cross by car. You had to take a 15-minute cross. There were 2 ferries running. And when we came up onto the Port Hawkesbury off the ferry, the telephone wires, or electric wires, I presume they were electric wires, were too low for the height of the truck and the furniture. And of course, the truck hooked into the wires and started knocking off some of the furniture at Port Hawkesbury. Well, I'll tell you, I'll never forget that. That was quite a day, 24 hours to move from Truro to Arishat and be unloaded. So I'll never remember that day.
So, what was Arishat like?
Well, I'll tell you, Arishat was lovely, nice in summer. Couldn't get a better place. Cool air, but mind you, I couldn't sleep at night because I couldn't hear the trains. I was so used to hearing the trains in Truro, the blowing of the whistles by Lower Onslow. We lived in Queen Street, and below the street was Lower Onslow, and this where the train, about 4 or 5 miles of track, and you hear the freights blowing all night. But after a while I got that I didn't miss them. But in summer it was very nice. A lot of tourists, and the days were long, and you didn't mind not having lights. But when September and October came, short days and no lights except 1 gas light in the house, plus the lights, and we had to pump water by hand to fill a tank up in the attic, just to have a little bit of water. And it was quite, and of course no paved roads. And mind you, Arishat was known where you fenced the cattle out. In my day, the cattle, the road, there was a fence in front of your house. Everybody had a fence in front of their house to keep the cattle on the road, eating the grass on the side of the road. And the cattle would have a bell, and every night, as a rule, every cow came home to the place where they were owned and milked. But there were a few people sold milk. We didn't have a cow, but very few people had milk for sale. Mostly everybody had their own cow in those days. For a matter of fact, Ripley, believe it or not, had that in his cartoons once, Arishat, where the cows are fenced out. So it was quite a thing.
How is that different than Truro?
No. There were some large houses, but on the average they were smaller than the Truro homes. But the home that we had bought was a large 4-room house. But they were not that common. But the average house was smaller. And everybody had a small barn, they had a garden, they had their own vegetables, and everybody would have a pig. So when the fall came, people would salt a pig, they would have salt mackerel, they would have dry cod, which is a real scarcity today. But in those days you couldn't sell fresh fish. You had to put it up, except for when the blue fisheries came to Petit de Gras. Then of course it turned, the tide changed to fresh fish. But at the first going off it was all salt and dried.
What things did you have in Truro when you left there that weren't here in Ayrshire when you came? Was there electricity and so on in Truro, paved roads?
Well, of course, Truro had all those conveniences. We had a sewage, we had a town water supply with a reservoir, and we had fire protection, and we had paved roads and electric lights. Truro had all the conveniences necessary. But mind you, there weren't too many fridges in Truro when I left. We used to go to the ice, at our own home in Truro, we had an ice box. The fridges weren't that common. And I recall the iceman would come every day, and you could buy a block of ice for your ice fridge. And I recall we used to get chips of ice from the iceman. We'd go to the cart, they had a big wagon with a cover. And when they chipped the ice to put a block in your fridge, there were always little chips of cold of ice at the wagon, the ice cart. We used to go pick them up and suck them. I remember it was quite a treat. And one thing they had in Truro was a hurdy-gurdy. That's some of the amusements you had. This hurdy-gurdy, he'd have a winding crank, and he'd play the same tune over and over again. And people would go out and give him some change. He had a cup, or a little cup on the hurdy-gurdy. And he'd walk all around town, and he'd play this music in the residential area. And people would go out and give him some money. That's an old feature for an old time music affair. And hurdy-gurdy is what they called it.
Let's go back to your father for a minute. What was his career after he came to Ayrshire?
Well,
you mentioned he was inspector of schools, but
well, I tell you, it took a lot of his time. He was inspector of schools without a secretary. Today, there's no inspector of schools without an office operated by the government and a secretary. I can recall he'd be typing letters till 12 o'clock at night. And he'd be off in the morning, off with the car to these schools and dirt roads. I don't see how he did it. Bing, bang, the roads were rough, but he did it. And I tell you, he was very active as a hospital board member, and active. He's secretary of the Isle Madame Board of Trade for many years, and he was an excellent letter writer for us, for the Board of Trade.
when was the Board of Trade set up?
Well, I'll tell you, the Board of Trade was set up where I had a restaurant. There was a small building there, and it was known in my day as the sample room. Now, travelers used to come to Ayrshire, and they would stay a week. They would open up their samples of dry goods and whatnot, and display them in this small building called the sample room, and it was owned by Charlie Mozar. And so that they would take all the merchants from Isle Madame, turn about to this sample room, and that one traveller would come twice a year with fall goods and the summer goods, spring goods. And so I don't recall whether I tore that building down or not. It must have been torn down before I took it, before I bought that piece of land. I can't recall. But anyway, it was torn down, and I built this. That's where I built the Emile Drive-In.
that was the reason for starting up the Board of Trade?
Pardon?
That was the reason for starting up the Board of Trade?
No, the Board of Trade was in there, that's small.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Board of Trade, I'm starting to get my story straight. The Board of Trade was, they utilized the sample room for meetings.
Oh. Well, when was it founded?
The Board of Trade?
Mm.
Oh, gee, I mean, I'm not too good memory years, but the Almaden Board of Trade must have been operating 20 years ago. Oh, yes. 25 years ago. The Almaden Board of Trade was in operation 25 years ago, and I would say it was in operation for about 10 years.
So how long did your father serve as inspector of schools?
Well, if I remember correctly, I would say about 10 years. About 10 years.
Then he retired.
That's correct.
So when did he die?
Well, now, you know what, the actual year, I don't know. But he lived to 90, he lived to the age of the ripe age of 98. But my memory fails me on the year.
I'd like to go back and get a little bit more of a sense of what Ayrshire was like when you first came here.
Well, the courthouse was as it is today, without the extensions, and the Royal Bank was in that was on the corner of Lower Street and Joe's Lane, they call it. It's now a centre for what do they call it now? The
Active living center.
yes. But there was a wharf down below my place. On the property I bought for the Emile drive-in, there was a wharf there and a shed for taking off the freight. The freight came in by boat from Halifax. There were coastal boats that brought most of the freight in. Most of our freight came by boat, either from Halifax or from Mulgrave. and another thing that was a great disadvantage, we had no snowplows in those days. The roads, every house had to supply one snow shoveler, free, to shovel the roads to make them passable for the doctors. And they didn't have to shovel them for any wider than for a horse and sleigh. And I can recall one winter, we were so plugged up with snow that you couldn't even get a horse load of feed in from the mainland by road. They had to send an icebreaker here in Ayrshire. And I recall well that I didn't know how icebreakers operated until then. I thought the icebreaker broke the ice with its bow, but now the bow is so made that it lifts up. The weight of the boat climbs up on the ice, and the weight of the boat breaks the ice. And I can hear it makes quite a crash when you hear that ice breaking. And I remember well that they landed feed and flour on that boat to feed for the shortage at Almaden. And we had no wharf. The wharves, we had a wharf at the Big Hill. There's another thing. There used to be a wharf at the Big Hill. The wharf down by the post office here in the center of town. Well, that wharf got plugged up with ice so thick, and the ice was so thick that nothing could break through it. I recall that we had 20 below zero that winter, and I don't think we've seen it since.
20 below zero
20 below
Fahrenheit?
zero in Ayrshire.
Fahrenheit?
That was cold. And I can remember as a boy, when it got to 10, when it got to 10 below, it was warm then. After having 20 below, it was warm when you saw 10 below.
That's Fahrenheit.
Fahrenheit, oh yes, Fahrenheit.
So the winters were that bad, were they?
That's how bad they were. I recall that, well, we had 2 hotels in that day. We had the American Hotel, which was across the street from where I live, and there was the Cutler House, a few houses to the left, and the travellers used to come in by the regular boat, but they couldn't come to the Ayrshire Wharf, so they came to the big hill, which was mostly always open. So I recall that I used to take my father's car when he couldn't get out, when he couldn't move. I used to go from the Ayrshire Hotel, the American House they called it. Did I mention that? The American House. And I used to go down on the wharf, down on the ice, just below this what you call sample room. And I'll tell you, it's it's exactly where the slip is today. That was the only place that the car could get on the ice. And I'd get the car on the ice. I had a path made from the American Hotel to that slip, where the slip is now, and I would drive out to the boat. And mind you, it was some cold. If it wasn't for the car with the heater and the windows up, terribly cold when you're on the ice with the wind and high temperatures. So I used to bring the travellers and the travelling public. I used to just go back and forth to the hotel and the boat. And one day, the Sheriff Poirier from West Ayrshire, he was living in Port Hood, and he was married to one of the LeBlancs from West Ayrshire. So he was late coming. They saw him coming, a horse and sleigh from West Ayrshire, and he was late to catch the boat. So I told the boat captain, I'll go get him. So I drove the car around the front of the boat, and wasn't there a crack in the ice? And the wheel fell, the front wheel fell in the crack of the ice. So they had to get the crew up from the boat to lift the car up, the front end, and shove it over. And then I continued to get the sheriff. So there were many instances where we were really isolated compared to Truro. There was nothing like that in Truro. There wasn't even the water. There's one thing I did not miss in Truro. There was no water to miss. We had an Albany Harbour here, which was one thing that had over Truro.
I'm just wondering if you could describe this property next door here, what that was like, the area around the Lenoir Forge. And
well, I tell you, the Lenoir Forge, they had made a nice house. The stone structure, the stone structure of the Lenoir Forge was then used for an ice house. They would cut ice out on Bobby's Lake, the first lake here, out in the Grand Dig Road, and in the winter time they would haul the ice in by horse or oxen. They had both horse and oxen. There were more oxen than horses in those days. And they'd fill that with ice for the summer. Now, there used to be an old shed on this end of the stone structure, but it was never used for anything, not in my day. And then there was the wharf for the smaller boats, and the shed there to store the freight until the local truckman would deliver it to the stores, or you'd get it personally with your own conveyance. And there was a scale house there, a scale house for weighing coal. The vessels would land coal down at this wharf, because the wharf wasn't as high up at the post office wharf. It's very high, and it was very hard to unload the vessels there, but the vessels would dock down below here, and they used to have two real cold cart, just a two-wheel affair, to take a half a ton of coal, and they would weigh each load as it came up.
And to the east of the forge, what was there?
Well, at the east of the forge was this building for storage from the wharf. Oh yeah, and pardon me, there was another shed there, but it was just vacant. There was the shed for the freight, and there was another shed to the northeast of that, right, to the northeast.
It was a Charlie Malzor who owned all of.
He owned all that property, and that property came to me when I bought when I bought it as such, with the dilapidated buildings, and then I cleaned things up, and I gave the forge to the municipal. I'll tell you, the centennial year came up, and of course the government were giving funds for centennial projects. So being a councillor at that time, I suggested to the council that I would give them the forge if they would have it reconstructed, and so they applied for the funds and they received it. So it was 1/3 each, 1/3 provincial, 1/3 municipal, and 1/3 federal. And so the property now, as I gave it to them, belongs to actually the municipality.
What was Charlie Malzor's business?
Well, Charlie was a man of all trades. He had a milk business, and he was agent for the boat, bringing the freight in, Halifax and from Mulgrave, and he was a register of deeds. So he had these. They were all small jobs, but he kept busy until he died of cancer eventually. And he was from the Lenoir family. His one side of it must have been on his mother's side. His mother must have been a Lenoir, because that's how he inherited the property.
What other businesses were operating in Ayrshire when you came?
Well, we had one merchant, G.J. LeBlanc. He was a very active merchant, and there was John Lebrun. That is the grandfather to that'd be the grandfather to Harold Lebrun. But it started with I understand he had lost a leg, but he came here with a peg leg, I believe I was told, and he built this big store, and he was a successful merchant. Then it was left to his son Arthur, and it went on the rocks. He failed up. Then a son by the name of Harold took it over, and he made a success. And then a son by the name of John took over, and then it failed up again. So the story had its ups and downs with the Lebrun family, and it's now owned by the IGA. That's how many hands that turned. And now opposite the bank, there was this Joe Sampson. He was a successful grocery store. And then there was a store up by there was a store down by the post office, operated by the Shaws. And it was latterly bought over by Joe Woodrow, Joe Peck, as they known. And then he sold out when the new drugstore came in, and then it was turned into apartments. And opposite that was the liquor store. But the liquor store originally was owned by the Binnies. That's before my day. I believe that they had dry goods and groceries. But then that was converted to a liquor store for some 30 years, I would say, and now it's owned by Premium Fish, a very successful fish operation. And then there was another store to the east of my house here, or to the next door. It was Constant Terrio. They were originally boat builders, and he had a grocery store. That's demolished now. That was about the extent of the commercial business in Ayrshire in those days, and the two hotels.
And where did you guys move what was your first house?
Well, the first house we moved to was Constant Terrio's house, owned by May Terrio, his widow. That was the house to the west of the store, but only about 4 feet apart. That's the first house we bought, and that was my father's house. And then I bought the house next to that, which was owned by a brother. The two houses are quite similar, and I bought the house next to that when I got married. And then when my father left Ayrshire, Wilfred Sampson was the next buyer of my father's house. So as it stands now, the two houses are side by side, pretty well alike.
What businesses did you become involved in?
Well, I tell you, the reason I stayed in Ayrshire, I had a touch of high blood pressure when I left Truro, and I believe I was getting to the point that I was involved in stock market operations, and I wasn't sleeping nights. And the doctor said that the best thing for me to do is I should get out of it and take it and relax and have lots of rest. I was too young to have such a problem. But I had to get out because the 29 market crash cleaned me out. And I was more or less depressed from all that went on. And so I started a fox ranch. My father bought me a piece of land up on the high road. And I learnt enough in Truro at manual training to build a little house. I built a shed, or it was a small building to operate from. I had to have a feed house and a meat grinder, and all was necessary, all the tools necessary to run a fox ranch. I built this small building, and all by myself. And then I built cages for the foxes. And all during this time, the fox market was going down. The price of foxes, you'd get $500 for a silver fox in those days. So it was quite a prize. But by the time I had enough foxes to sell any, the price was way below, down to $25 a pelt. So I eventually, all the fox farms in Nova Scotia died out because of the market. So, but what happened after that? While I was in the fox business, I started to sell a few oil burners for heating purposes and for cooking. And Imperial Oil were selling the burners in order to sell the oil. So I put in a few burners, and when the fall came, we started to think, well, what are we going to do next winter? No boats to bring the oil in. The roads are plugged, no snowplow, no tractors, nothing moves. And here they were with oil burners, and the oil used to come from Halifax in 45-gallon drums. And there was a truckman here in town known for years, Johnny Edwards. He had a low bed truck. It was very easy to load the barrels on at the wharf. So Imperial Oil came up with the idea. They said, we will supply all your customers with what oil they want, with a number of barrels they want. And you go around every month and collect for the empty barrels. So it worked fine the first winter. That's what went on. And the next winter, of course, everybody, we knew then the scheme was working well. So for 2 or 3 years, I was doing that after when the Fox business was going down all the time, and eventually I gave it up. So in the end, Imperial Oil had a wholesale depot in St. Peter's, and that wholesale depot needed a tank truck, and it was to supply Almadam as well as Richmond County mainland. So they wanted a new representative, agent we were so called. We were commission agents in those days for it. So I was appointed commission agent for Richmond County. And so I bought a truck. I can recall it so well. I bought a maple leaf truck with a deluxe cab, deluxe leather seat, with a big red box, stake body on it, with what you call lift-off tanks. These tanks held 200 gallons each, and we had a stand built in St. Peter's to pull the tanks on and off, so you could load it with barrels, drums of oil, and deliver drums or deliver bulk. And the idea was that I would haul the barrels from Sydney. When I was out of barrels, I'd go to Sydney with the truck. So that carried on. I would say for until 55, until about 1965. From 1942 until 1965, I ran the Imperial Oil, and during that time, I had one truck when I started, and I drove it. But when I was through, I had 3 trucks and 3 drivers. We had one truck delivering oil to Booth Fisheries, the fish company in Petit de Gras. They had more storage for oil at Booth Fisheries than I had in St. Peter's. For the wholesale business, I had one truck hauling from Sydney to Booth's almost daily. I had one truck hauling to Booth's daily, either from St. Peter's or Sydney. That's the amount of oil that the draggers used. That was the big business. That was the big deal. That was the business. That was the business in itself. And then, in the year 43, I would say, the war got going. The Second World War was going, and we had the foragents from West Irish. They were all sea captains, and the Lavengers, and the Merchant Marine offered them good positions. They were offered jobs on Merchant Marine boats, and it was a big deal for them. They immediately scuttled their vessels, and they stopped hauling coal. And the people here in Almadam, where were they going to get their coal? Well, I was the only fellow in the truck. Well, I was one of the big truckers in the area. I was the only one with a fleet of trucks. And then you couldn't buy new trucks. The government put a ban on new trucks. So what do? Borrow what you have, and then have nothing, or so in any event, I started with one truck to haul coal for people that were desperate for fuel for the winter. And as the gas business dropped, I took a gas truck off the St. Peter's route, and then I used two trucks to haul coal. And so then I got everybody supplied with coal just before the snow started in 1943. And that continued for, I'd say, I must have been in the business for about 10 years before the war was over and people got back to getting oil for heat. Then, of course, the oil furnace came in, then the electric power came in, and of course the whole cycle changed. Coal is out. You don't see a coal truck here now. Nobody uses coal. It's either wood or oil, and it's mostly all oil.
What other businesses did you get involved in?
Well, I thought I was going to retire then. Thought it was time to quit. I gave up Imperial Oil, and as soon as I gave it up, all the competitors were in. While I was in the business, no competitor tried to come in, because it seems we. So then, as soon as I quit, there were 2 or 3 oil companies came in, and everybody was selling oil. So then I retired, and I built the bowling alley. I said, well, this is going to be easy. I retired and have no worries. That's when my worries started all over again. There weren't enough people. I built a bowling alley with 8 lanes. Yeah, 8 lanes, right. No, must have been, or 6. 6 lanes, I think it was. Or however much. No, it was 8 lanes we had, right, 4 and 4. 4 on one side, 4 on the other. So we built this building up on the high road, known as the liquor store today. And I ran that for 4 years. The first year was a success. The second year, it started to drop off. The first year that we had men's leagues and ladies' leagues, and we had the mixed leagues. But the next year, they didn't want to play, they wanted to play in one league only. The men would play in the men's league or the mixed league. Well then, that wasn't too bad. But the third year, the winners didn't want to break away from their league. So, you know, if the winners all stayed together and the losers all stayed together, you knew the score before you started. Mm. and of course, the losers didn't want that. They wanted them to mix up. So then the fourth year, it got to the point that I had to pay, the payments were too. The lanes cost $80,000, and I had to pay $1,000 a month, right, $12,000 a year, and we couldn't meet the demand. And the only thing I opted for 2 years. I think I would say 2 years more. We fed. It was we used the building for a cafeteria for the school until the new school was built. When the new school was built, they had their own cafeteria, so then it ended the cafeteria of the bowling alley. Being we're just below the school, the children were allowed to come there to eat. And then we held some bingos until eventually I sold to the government for a liquor store. And then I guess, oh yes, and then I built the shade. I'll tell you what, I discovered that there was room for a quick food service, takeout service. I assessed the school. We lost the school business, and then I felt there was room for a takeout service in the village. So that's when I built Shea Mill Drive-In, and that operated for about 20 years until it burnt last year.
What about the dairy?
Oh yes, I'm forgetting that. I was into so many things I can't remember them. I can't remember them all. Well, there was one of the Latimers. One of the Latimers had a farm for sale, 100 acres, up on the high road, in the Barishwa end of the high road. So I felt, well, for $1,000, this was quite a buy, $10 an acre for a 100-acre farm. So I was always interested in farming, and I took a fancy to the pole barn. I got in contact with the Agricultural College in Truro, and they gave me plans for a loafing barn. And I built the first loafing barn in Kilburn. Now, by means of, they called it a loafing barn because the cows were not tied. They walked around the barn all winter, and they were not tied, and they came into a milking parlor. I had a modern milking parlor. The cows came in one door and out the other, and they were all milked automatically, and all worked well until the winter came. I was not told, or perhaps I was not told that, or it may have been, that you had to use straw for bedding. And when you use straw for bedding and the cow manure, it created a heat, combustion, or what was the word? Fermentation, that was it. It would ferment the straw and the manure, cow manure, would cause a fermentation that created heat. And when the cows would lie down on that, they were in a warm bed. But you can't grow grains on Isle Madame. The season is too short. You can grow grains in inland, by say, in the district of Waikagma, in that area. But here we can't grow grains, and I use sawdust. And what happened? The sawdust only froze with the cow manure, and the production of milk my production of milk dropped tremendously in the wintertime. And of course, with no milk, you haven't got money to buy feed. So I operated for 3 or 4 years. I brought in, and secondly, I discovered that there was no money in shipping the milk. We had to pasteurize it and retail it. So what happened? I built a pasteurizing plant down on the lower street. And then I took 12 farms, I think, 12 farms in the area. I handled their milk. I established 3 milk routes, one to St. Peter's, one for Isle Madame, and one to Port Hawkesbury. And what happened, as things went along, we weren't getting enough for our milk. We had to have a raise in milk, a raise in the price. Well, now a small farmer had a ghost of a chance to go before the Public Utility Board and get a raise for the price of milk. And the big dairies were having trouble, not enough money. So the big dairies bought out all the small dairies in Nova Scotia, and I was included. And then once they got control of the little dairies out of the way, there was only farmers and what's the name of that Antigonish? It was called the co-op dairy in Antigonish. But what do they call it now?
Farmers.
There's farmers and what do they call it?
Scottsburn.
What do they call that blue truck there? The truck that there are 2 trucks coming in here now. Farmers.
And Scottsburn.
Scottsburn is the word. Scottsburn bought up the co-op. And mind you, they go before the board every year. They ask for a raise in price of milk, they get it. The farmer gets a raise, and the milk processing plants get a raise. And another thing that would have killed the small dairy was the plastic carton. It cost about $75,000 for a good sealer, a good bottling machine. And a small dairy can't afford that, and the bottles were finished. The bottles were on the, once those wax milk container came out, that was the right product. No bottle washing. That was a big problem. Bottle washing. And so then I kept the dairy until it was bought over and closed.
I want to talk a bit about some of the in the on Isle Madame over the years.
Well, number one, one of the first things that we greatly appreciated was the highway from Grand Anse by way of Discouse to Arishat. That was our first paved road. I recall the time that when you were on the bridge, it was so pleasant to drive on a smooth piece of road, crossing the bridge at Lennox Ferry was a pleasure. And it was unbelievable when we had the paved road into Ayrshire. It was such a relief. And then, consequently, in time, they joined the road from Ayrshire to West Ayrshire to Martinique, and then they did Petit de Gras.
In that order?
In that order, that's how it went. And then they did the outskirts. They did after Petit de Gras was done, they went to the Point and Little Lance, and then they went to Jarmusch Harbour from West Ayrshire. And the last piece they did was the Grendig Road. So it is now complete. And I believe if that paving was not complete today, I would say it would take a number of years before we'd see it. We were very fortunate to get it completed before the squeeze came on money.
Around what time was that? Was that after the war?
Oh yes. Oh yes, that was all after the war. After World War, yes. And I recall going to Sydney, even though when the Sydney road was not paved. To go to Sydney in the olden days, it was a 2-day trip. To go back and forth in one day, you take and cars in those days didn't have power steering. You take the arms off you to drive a car in those days in the rough roads, and the road to Sydney was almost like a corkscrew. It was so crooked, and hills and potholes. Oh, it was a real killer. People today don't appreciate that paved road as they should.
What about the telephones?
Oh, well, there's another problem. The telephone company, after the war, the Booth Fisheries were having all kinds of trouble contacting the markets for their fish, prices and the quantity required. And the pressure came on to do something with the telephone. Well, it so happened that a few years prior to the Booth Fisheries, the old folks that controlled the telephone company were LeBlanc's. The doctor, this is not Dr. B.A. LeBlanc's family, but another LeBlanc. I remember her name as Sabine Rose LeBlanc. She was the widow that owned the controlling shares of the Isle Madame Telephone Company. Well, she died, and her son Raymond became the shareholder, the principal shareholder. The shares were left to him, and he was in Montreal, and of course he wanted to get his 10%. They were paying 10%, which was a very good revenue. But the telephone line was not satisfactory. So the old folks had appointed me as president of the company. Well, the operator from its inception to its final stages was Laura Cutler at the Cutler House, and that's where the central switchboard was. And she was only getting about $30 a month, or $35, as operator. Imagine, for 24-hour service, 7 days a week, she had to be at the helm. So I told her, if she'd make out the bills, the secretary was supposed to make out the bills. So I said, if you'll make out the bills, I'll give you the president's salary, the president and secretary. And I think that was $45. So that gave her 35, and 45 made her 80. And so she was very happy for that. So I just was acting without pay. And so I called in the shareholders, and this Raymond, the son, at a meeting, and I held a meeting at my farmhouse. And it was voted, oh yes, in the interim, I had contacted Maritime Tell, and they said they would only offer us $2,000 for the company. That was for the existing telephone lines and the switchboard at the Cutter House. So of course, Mr. Raymond LeBlanc wasn't keen on accepting $2,000 because he was getting 10% of his investment, which was around $5. So but the shareholders, all the rest of the shareholders said there was no use. That they were giving up the telephone if he didn't accept the sale at $2,000. So he did, and the Maritime Town took over. They wouldn't even allow us for goodwill, for the future of the Booth fisheries. We thought that the future of the Booth fisheries would be a big money earner for them. But the Maritime only gets paid for the distance from Petit de Gras to the American border. Then the rest of the telephone bill had to be paid to American companies. So they didn't get all the increase. So today, we're thankful for a good telephone company. Private telephones everywhere, and in those days there was only 2 or 3 lines were private because of the distance to the operator.
There's only 2 or 3 people on the island who had private lines?
That's very few. Only in Arishat. People out of Arishat couldn't get it. In Arishat village, you could get a private line. But outside of Arishat, there was only one private line, was to the Booth fisheries. Because you had to run a wire direct to that outfit and back. It's not like today, you know.
You had to run a wire directly from the
central to Booth fisheries. I meant you had to have 2 wires. You had to have 2 wires. So you had to have 2 wires for every private telephone. But in town, the distance was short, and you could do it. But to call West Arishat or Discouse or Petit de Gras, it was all public telephone.
How many subscribers on the island?
For the telephone?
When it was sold?
When it was sold? Well, I would say about 80.
80 subscribers. So there wasn't a very high percentage of the population of Island M who had telephone.
That's right. That's correct. And the reason for it was because you couldn't have private lines outside of Arishat. If you want to make a private call, you had to come to town, to Arishat, to make it. Because you had a private line from here out to Hawkesbury. That's where we were. We were connected to the operator to the central in Hawkesbury, to the Maritime Town.
And there wasn't the money on the island to modernize it.
Oh no, we couldn't raise the money, and not only that, you didn't have the men. You had to have experts in the business that knew the business. You couldn't afford to hire such personnel.
What about the power?
The power line? Well, that came next. What we did, we appointed, I was appointed to take care of Arishat, and we had somebody to take care of Arishat, of the West Arishat, Discouse and Petit de Gras. We had to go house to house in every district and find out how many would take the power. And we were able to get it, I forget how many names we had to get, but we were able to get enough names to get the power. And they put out at Martell's in Pondville, they put a stationary dynamo, a diesel motor, running a generator. And this operated I don't know if it operated all day or not. At the first going off, it didn't. It was only part of the day. But it soon ran day and night. And that operated until the load got heavy enough that they had to bring power in. Like the both fisheries needed 3-phase. They needed high-powered equipment. They had high-powered equipment, and they had 3-phase. Is all heavy equipment is 3-phase instead of 2. Apparently, it's cheaper to operate on 3-phase than 2-phase. And the Booth fisheries wanted that for their cold storage. That was the big power user with cold storage. So they ran the lines in, and then of course the Power Commission took over the whole thing. And
Power Commission took over when?
when?
Did they? What's the Power Commission who set the company up originally?
That's right.
Who installed the power originally?
That's correct. On a small scale, that's right. It was the Nova Scotia Power from the very start. But they grew and grew and grew. They grew by leaps and bounds. It's only now that they have an oversupply of electric power now. For the first time, I would say, since 1942, the Nova Scotia Power Commission has a surplus of power.
Did most people take the power when it was offered?
Not everybody, but most of them did. Most of them did. And we had in those days, each one that took the power had the privilege to put one man on the line to dig post holes. In those days, you didn't dig post holes with the bucket with the equipment you have today. You had to dig it by a crowbar and a shovel, and you had a shovel like a spoon. The shovel was like a spoon. You put that down the hole and lift it up so you wouldn't make your hole too big around. That's how you did the crowbar and a spoon shovel. And mind you, there was fighting for those jobs. Work was so scarce in the 30s when they did this. That I'm telling you, if you gave one man one day more than the other, you were in trouble. And the guys, those that went around and got the solicited the names for power, they were the ones that were asked to give the work out. And that was a very unpleasant job, because if you gave one man a little extra work by mistake, you heard about it, let me tell you. You soon found out that you were unfair. I'm telling you that today the teenagers wouldn't fight to dig post holes. And mind you, they were only paid about 30 cents an hour then. That's all I used to get when I was working for the telephone company at the Isle Madame before I became president. I was getting 25 cents an hour to dig post holes.
What about radios?
Well, they were mighty slow in coming in. I'll tell you what, we had a radio, and I tell you what we did. Me and my father was driving the car every day without fail. I ran some wires. I ran some old telephone wires we had a garage, an old barn down there, an old fish shed, and we had a door put in that barn to put the car in wintertime. And so I had 2 wires with 2 clips, and I ran it from the barn to the house to the radio. And it was so we bought a battery radio. The first radios that came out ran on 6 volts, because you had no power, eh? So every night when my dad would get home, I'd clip on the clips on the battery of the car to run the radio at night. And by doing that every day, 2 volts ran your radio. It didn't kill your battery. Your battery was good for 3 or 4 nights. So if you just did it one night at a time, well, there was no problem. So otherwise, you had to buy dry cells. You had to buy dry cell batteries, and they didn't last very long when you ran your radio any length of time. You had to run your radio sparingly in those days. And of course, TV wasn't even heard of then. That was quite a thing to be able to tune in to the hockey games and the baseball games and just hear it. That was wonderful.
Who had radios? Were they common or?
Oh no, they weren't that. No, they were quite scarce. And I remember so well. You knew every car that went by. The cars were that scarce. The priests in every parish had a car, and the doctors had a car. The banker had a car, and the banker didn't have a car until the latter years. The first bankers didn't have a car, but the latter years. I remember one of our bankers by the name of Clarence Campbell. He came here from Lordways as a junior in the bank. Then he was transferred to the bigger branches, Tyrone here and there. And when he landed in Narrashad as manager, he didn't have a car for 3 or 4 years as manager before he could buy a car. And his first car cost him under $1,000. That's all he had to pay for a car in those years. He was saying that now he bought a sit-down, the other day I was speaking to him, he bought a sit-down power more, but cost him more than his first automobile. Cut his lawn. He's now retired in Antigonish. So it's quite a change. And as you say, the manager was considered, a well-paid man. So that you can see that you knew every car that came along, who it was.
So tell me about, you talked a little bit about cars already, cars and trucks. What were the road conditions like?
Well, the road conditions were terrible until it was paved. Terrible potholes, all potholes. And of course the tractor would go over them. Before the tractor got around to doing it, the summer, before the tractor would grade it twice a year. It would take twice a year to pull the grader around the island, and then the winter would set in. And of course, when you fill potholes with loose clay, when the rain strikes, well, the hole comes right back. Until the road was paved, the road conditions were terrible, and the dust was terrible.
What was the impact of both fisheries at Better Ground?
Oh well, I'll tell you right now. I used to go out there years ago when I was in the oil business. I'd go there with a whole load of gas barrels, about a dozen to 20 barrels of gas on the truck. And then I'd go there, I can recall so well going there in the evening when the fishermen were home from fishing. And I'd distribute all these barrels up to the fishermen. That's how many fishermen were out there. Say there must have been 25 and 30 boats. And I was out there the other day, there were just 2 boats anchored out there in Little Lands Harbor. 2 boats, as compared to 30, 35. They were just like bees around me for the gas. I'd drop a barrel here and there and keep going. Well, there were fish heads all along the shore road, the shore there. And they'd buy 1 and 2 barrels at a time. And as soon as the plant came, there's where the change came. The boats, they stopped fishing, little by little. And then now that's the change. All you have there now is there are 2 or 3 fishermen with a lobster license. And that's all the fishing that's done over there now, as compared to 3 dozen boats. And now that the fishery is kaput, the younger generation are not going to be able to go fishing. They're going to have to get a different source of revenue. They're going to have to go to trade schools and leave home. This is the unfortunate part of it. So we've seen the fish industry start at 0, get up to a very high degree of efficiency, down to nothing. Overfishing. And the old captains of the old first draggers said, this will never last. This will not last. And how true their story was, true that was.
involved in the community quite a bit since you've been in Ayrshire.
Oh yes.
What were some of the organisations that you were involved in?
Well, if I can remember, I was well, I was involved on the hospital board, and I was involved in the board of trade, and well, I was involved in bringing salvaging the other farmers around the area by buying their milk, by having the dairy, and of course that kept me pretty. Oh yes, and I bought a couple of used draggers once. There were two or three fishermen came up here from Digby that had small draggers, and they had made a success fishing Flanders in Digby, the bay, St. Mary's Bay, that's in Digby area, and so they came up here with these draggers, and they offered them for sale cheap because they had fished the fish out, and there was no more fish in that area, so that they I wasn't aware that the same thing could happen here. So I bought these two draggers, and I put local men on them, and mind you, they got some fish for the first going off, for the first fall. But by the end of the fall, the fish was all gone. Kept them another season, no more flatfish. They call them Flanders. And every time they'd come ashore, there was always 101 things wrong on the boat. Let me tell you, it was terrible. They'd come home Saturday nights, and they had a whole list of repairs to be done over the weekend so they could go back Monday morning. So it meant that we had to work Sundays to keep them going. It was a real effort to keep them afloat. So I soon got rid of that. And Harold LeBrun had one too, and his caught a fire and burnt. So that ended the small draggers for this area.
Tell me a little bit about your involvement in. I've heard there was an athletic society in Ayrshire.
Well, I tell you what, I didn't take too much part in athletics because I didn't have time. But I was a member of the Irish Athletic Association, and I always helped them when I could. But I actually didn't take any part. My brother Dar, he finished his high school here. He took part in playing hockey. He was the goaltender for the Irish hockey team. And in those days, there was a boat ran from Canso to Ayrshire to Mulgrave and back at night. So they used to go to Canso to play hockey. The boys remember him well, as they found he was a good goaltender. So we took on Canso. We went home in the afternoon boat and came back the next morning.
What about you mentioned you were on the hospital board. What was your contribution to the hospital board?
Well, we had some trying days in those times. There was a conflict between some of the board members and the doctors and the nursing staff. There were many problems. I recall one meeting we had to call the meeting off and everybody went home over trying to get things to work smoothly. But in the end, we came to agreements and everything turned out all right in the end. That's about. I know that I was glad when my term was up, because it's very touchy when there is a conflict in such matters in a small community. But everything turned out well in the end.
You told me a story about buying the land to build a hospital, the new hospital in Ayrshire.
Oh yes, yes. That was true. That was true, yes, we had a meeting. Yes, no, yes, I did recall that there was a problem. Yes, we needed land to build a new center. The old hospital, which was the Bishop's Palace, was too small. And I don't know how, apparently a selected number of the board of the hospital were asked to go to Father Poirier's leap house after this meeting we had, stating that Father Poirier had received permission, that Father Poirier had received permission to buy Jimmy Turl's property for a hospital center, and they were wanting to close the deal in a hurry in case he changed his mind. So Father Poirier asked if there was anybody could cover for a check for 2 or 3 days for $2,000. And I said that I could do it, but I could arrange to cover for that amount for a week. So I gave my check to Father Poirier for $2,000, and Father Poirier in turn gave a parish check for $2,000. So it wasn't known where the money first came from. And the piece of land that the hospital center is now on was bought the next day for $2,000. And I was told since that he was very sorry he had sold it.
You were involved in the building of the school in Ayrshire?
Oh yes, that's true. There are so many things that come up that I forget. That's true. I was I was appointed chairman of the building committee for Richmond County, and of course that meant all the schools, all these new schools that were built in my time and Harold LeBrun and I he was chairman of the finance committee. So Harold LeBrun and I worked hand in hand for the whole deal. The building of the Ayrshire School, the Petit de Gras School, St. Peter's, Johnstown, and I think we had some construction in Woodsdale too. Although I don't believe that was done after I was retired. But anyway, we changed. Irish had only had 4 classroom school that belonged to the municipality. The other rooms were in the convent. And the convent was owned by the parish, and the sisters were running that. So what they wanted a school that would contain all the classes from kindergarten up. So this was the first of the new buildings ever built. It was the Ayrshire or the Isle Madame District School. That was quite a change from the 4 classroom school we had. And mind you, we had a hard enough time to get the vote for that. That was a big deal to build that. If I remember correctly, in those days that was over $100,000. I think it was $140,000, and that was a tremendous amount of money in those days to put into a school. And mind you, we had to get the vote of the council to approve it. And of course the mainland weren't in favor of our spending all this money, because this was going to go on their tax load too. So, but we received the vote, the majority vote, to borrow the money to match the government's share to build the school. And this gave us a gymnasium, a cafeteria, And I think the school has been greatly appreciated until this last year. They had a problem, but up until this last year, I think the school has done well in satisfying the educational system.
Who opposed it on the mainland?
Who voted?
Who opposed it? Who
Oh.
opposed it?
Well, no, I can't tell you that. I can't remember that. I know that they didn't all vote for it. The thing is, there was always one more councillor on the mainland than Isle Madame. And when it came to a close vote, they had a one majority.
Was that ever a problem on council?
What, the voting?
The
Oh.
island mainland thing.
Oh, it was a problem all the time. It was the major problem for the Isle Madame, for the area of Isle Madame. Councillors, always. The mainland always had the majority vote.
And they voted. They generally didn't vote for anything on island.
That's correct. That is, I'm telling you, that was our greatest fight. But when they, and one of the fight was, one was the hospital, or the centre. Now I'll tell you where the dicker was. We told the mainland, you vote that the land had been bought for our centre. We said, you vote for us for the centre in Arishat, Isle Madame district. We will give you the first senior citizens home to be built. And that's exactly what happened. We voted the next 2 years. We voted, what did they call the centre in St. Peter's?
Richmond Villa.
Yeah, that's right, Richmond Villa, right. So the Richmond Villa was built, we voted for them 100%, and they voted for us 100% for ours. And when the villa was built, they allowed for the kitchen services for twice the size. And that came up. And the council again voted that the extension be put at the villa for the efficiency of the kitchen services that was built for twice the size. And now the next move was to have the next expansion was to come to Arishat. And they're supposed to be the war vets are supposed to build a section of 4 or 5 rooms on the Arishat division. But they were there this year and surveyed it again, and that was supposed to come out this year. The war vets are to pay for it, and the war vets are to have preference in the new section. If they're empty, you can put civilians there, but if the war vets have application, they're to get in there first and have first priority.
Were there any other conflicts in council? I'm thinking maybe water and sewer.
Well, I don't know what. Well, not so much. I'll tell you why. The last thing I did in council was I had a meeting at the Arishat School in July or August of that year. I had received approval for the waterworks for Arishat, and we had to accept their approval. We had to accept the government approval for it, and we had this public meeting, and I had a committee appointed to survey the work. And I remember that Ralph Britt was one of the ones that was named on that committee. There were 3. So I had done my part. I had received approval from Halifax to have the job done. And all they wanted 3 of a committee forming the Arishat Waterworks. And the reason that we didn't have any opposition for that with the mainland is that each district had a separate taxation for this. So it was our funeral, not to pay. And St. Peter's was having trouble with their water supply by insufficient water, and they needed an improvement, and that was received for them too. But mean the see, this is where the trouble was. When the financing got that our taxation would impose on mainland taxation, that's where the friction came in. But the waterworks, we didn't have trouble on that score. And another thing that I did before I left council was I inaugurated the first Richmond County Industrial Commission. And of course, the fact that I got up and asked for it, they said, well, okay, you're going to have to be chairman. So that gave me another chore. I was chairman of the Industrial Commission for about 3 years until I resigned from council.
What did you accomplish in your time with the Industrial Commission?
Well, not too much. I'll tell you what, we got the okay for the first building. And then I was out. But the first building that was built there.
In Louisdale?
Yes, right. We had to apply. Whether it got built before I left or not, I don't know. But I know we applied for money, federal money, to build the first unit, and I believe that's all that was built. They didn't put an extension on, did they? I don't think. So the building the original building that was built. Why is it there? Somebody actually had a phone. Can we answer the phone?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Is there any trouble over the arena? I've heard different stories over the arena. Were you involved in that?
No, that was after my time. I tell you, that was in the making. That was in the making before I left council. But the trouble came after I was out of council. But I knew that the government threw in, I think, $25,000 after they'd given their share. Am I not right?
So you were involved in municipal politics for how long altogether?
For 12 years.
12 years, so 4 terms as councillor.
That's right. And mind you, we started at $150 a year. That was the councillor's pay then, $150 a year. And when I retired, it was $300. That was big money, $300 a year. Today, what is it, $1,500 or $2,000
I think it's 6,000.
for a councillor? Is that right? I was born too soon. Is that right? I didn't know it was that high. What's the warden get? 15,000?
20.
20. Well, that's worth having.
We'll talk a little bit more about politics in general. Did you know any of the provincial and federal politicians?
Oh yes, I knew them all.
Who was the first one that you had?
Well, of course, McCagan was so well known to everybody. And Orchard was well known to us. He was a local fellow, from West Bay. I'll tell you, it's quite a story. Your uncle, Joe Peck. I had my office at first was in the cellar of this house, and Bob Stanfield, a former premier of Nova Scotia, was in the office with Joe Peck talking politics in the office, and in this room here today, I was here with Orchard. What was his first name? What was his name? Earl Orchard. They were both running for the provincial government. Stanfield was looking to be Premier of Nova Scotia. I knew Stanfield from Truro as a boy. I went to school with him. Bob Stanfield. So I was on the Liberal ticket, and Joe Peck was on the Tory ticket, and neither one. I was the only one that knew, but the two politicians were in the house at one time. Now I'll tell you another story about politics. There was a fellow by the name of Ticky Woodrow in Little Lance. He was a real talking machine, and whatever way he voted, he swung about 15 votes. All his relatives, whatever he said went. And I recall there was some meeting in Petit de Gras, and I think it was more than it wasn't a political meeting, I don't think, but Stanfield was there. And I recall Stanfield's telling people that, he says, you know, I have to go see Ticky before I leave. And he left Petit de Gras to go see this Ticky that controlled 15 or 20 votes. And one day, another election, this would be provincial, but there was a federal election. And Alan McCacken was to meet Walter Bouger and I out in Little Lance to see that to overcome this Ticky. And Alan never showed up. And he lost the election by 3 or 4 votes that time. And we were there in Little Lance to save him in Little Lance. He never showed up. So it goes to show how you can't be too sure when it's election time.
What kind of men were they, these politicians that you know?
Well, it was Alan McCacken was a saver of all things for us. Alan McCacken, he received money for everything for us. He'd tell us how to apply, where to apply. They didn't have a DEFCO working for us in this area. We had to do it. We had to do it ourselves. And we had to have well, I tell you, the Almaden Board of Trade did most of the corresponding with the politicians. And Alan McCacken, that new highway we have from Hawkesbury to Grand Anse, and to as far as this end of St. Peter's. If it wasn't for Alan McCacken, that wouldn't be there today, and you'd never see it. We'd never see it if that wasn't built today. You'd never see that being built now. They're even talking about building a piece of road going to the North Shore Road, North Shore. You know what I mean, but Pugwash in that direction. And the contract, it'll be a pole road. You'll have to pay to go on that road. The government can't afford it. It'll be like a toll bridge. Every time, if they do it, the contractor agrees to finance it on a pole basis. And of course, Bob Stanfield, when Bob Stanfield was elected, he was a good member he was a good premier for Nova Scotia. But of course, the money in those days came from Ottawa, and of course, we were never so well off as when Jerry Doucette was a cabinet minister, and Alan McCacken was a cabinet minister. I've repeated that so many times to the people. We'll never see this age again. 2 cabinet ministers, you know, in a small municipality like we are. And we'd go to Halifax, and Doucette would work for us, and of course we didn't go to Ottawa. McCacken would come here, but we received a lot of government money, and well, you take McCacken being the deputy minister, the second in charge. He just wasn't turned on whenever we asked for it. But I'll tell you, some things that went wrong is that some of the money was mismanaged that we were given from these politicians. That's the unfortunate part. That's the unfortunate part.
Do you think of anything in particular? What it was?
Well, one thing is the swimming pool. We should have a swimming pool in operation today instead of nothing. That's a terrible mistake. Terrible blunder, I mean, wrong mistake. That was very unfortunate, because that would have been a lifetime thing. The water here in the harbour is too cold. But if we had that swimming pool and the tennis court and the ball field in operation, Petit de Gras has the ball field, and we haven't. That's about the biggest mismanagement deal that we've had. Do you think that'll ever get going?
I don't know. I'm almost out of questions. Well, I guess I should ask you about the house. You mentioned that this house belonged to one of the Terrio brothers.
That's right.
And they were both builders.
They were both builders. This house is all built with pegs. The framework, pegs are driven in, you know, heavy 8 by 8, 8 by 8 at least, and pegs driven through. And I'll tell you one thing. This ceiling here, they tell me they brought a man in from Antigonish to have this ceiling and the other room there done. That's plaster. The other house hasn't got this, but this house has. But they brought a man from Antigonish to make those ceilings. And it's amazing how well they've kept all these years. And the back porch, the front porch of this house was rotten when we bought the house. The clay coming down, we're low here, and every time it rains, the clay would come down, and it rotted all the sills of the old porch. So we changed the style of the porch, and when we came to fill in for the boards under the shingles, we had to put 2 by 3 on edge. So under the shingles, it's all 2-inch plank under the shingles, and then there's another 2-inch airspace besides that when they did the plastering. So the house is insulated all around by an airspace, and I did the ceiling with the modern insulation, filling between the rafters, or not the rafters, the ceiling joists, eh? The rafters are this way, so the house there's 3 times the lumber in this house that's needed, than would be needed. But lumber in those days, I bought lumber as low as $15 a thousand board feet from G.J. LeBlanc's. Came from Port Hood on the boats, on these coastal boats, $15 and $16 a board foot, 1,000 board feet. But lumber today would be 10 times that, wouldn't it?
Was there much traffic in Ayrshire when you first came?
Oh no. Very little. But as I say, you knew, every car went by, you knew who it was. And the only time there was anything doing, the big thing in Ayrshire in my day was to go to the post office and to the boat. That was a big thing. You went to the post office once a day, and you'd go down to the boat, see if you had any freight. Those were 2. And the dance hall was above the courthouse, above the municipal building here. You'd have a record player, and there's only one parish that the priest would allow dances, was Discoos. Father Bushy would allow dances, and the orchestras would come from Sydney. You know where the boat clubhouse is, Discoos? That was the hall. And they would bring an orchestra from Sydney to have dances there. and that place was packed. You can imagine it's a small hall.
There was a lawyer in Ayrshire in 1930s, J.J.
Oh,
Copeland.
Oh, yes,
I
yes,
was
yes.
wondering if you could tell me a little bit
Well,
about
mind you, he had a pretty hard time to make a living. Even a white lawyer would have it tough enough. But however, this captain, he was a very fine gentleman, very fine man. He was from St. George's. And he after he left, he used to always send my father a Christmas card. My father would send him one. And the first thing, my father had died, and the card came from Copeland. So of course then I wrote to him and told him what had happened, that he didn't receive a card from my dad. So we were in Florida one winter, and Clarence Campbell was retired, this former bank manager I spoke to you about. We were to Florida together. So we decided that we'd go to St. George's to visit him. I'm a little ahead of my story. He received a position as magistrate. St. George's was under British rule, and he became a magistrate, which was a high position in that area. So that was a real lift for him. So it was after he left here, and he sent the Christmas cards to my father after he became magistrate there. So we went to visit him, and so it was only about a 2-hour run by plane from Florida to the island, and they treated us they were very well treated. We stayed there overnight, and we flew back the next day. And while we were there was an American, well, you've seen on the TV, these American love boats, these big ocean liners for tourists. There was one anchored in the harbor at St. George's that night. And it's a very hilly country. They had a hard time to find enough flat land to have an airport that would take a fair-sized plane. It's all hilly. The island was noted for growing spices, all spices.
What was Copeland involved in when he was in Ayrshire, and how was he received?
Well, I tell you, he was well received. Everybody liked him, and he was greatly. He was active in the Athletic Society, and he was living in the house right across from the Mildred Power's daughter's living there, across from the old liquor store. Dr. The house this side of Winters. That's where he stayed. He had rented that house from Latimer's.
Just have two more questions. You told me once that you were somewhere the Bahamas, I believe, and you met a fellow who had been to Ayrshire on a vessel.
Oh, yes. Yes, we were in Bahamas, and we were just shopping downtown, and we happened to say, this fellow said, "Where are you from?" And we said we were from Ayrshire. Oh, well, he said, "I used to know Captain Boudreau from Ayrshire. I used to swim out to his boat. And this Captain Boudreau, this place here was just torn down a few years ago. Was that building up in your time? They called it Jane Tommy. And her husband was Captain Tom Boudreau. And he used to go to the Bahamas with a load of lumber, and he'd bring back mostly molasses. And this clerk, as a kid, they used to have to anchor off from the wharves, you know, just in the harbour where he was, this behemoth where we were. And they'd swim out for tokens. The crew would give all these fellas tokens to swim ashore with. And then he knew another captain that Clarence Campbell was with us on the shopping tour, and his wife. He knew a fellow from Lardways, another captain that had gone there. So we knew one from Ayrshire, and he knew one from Lardways. So I'm telling you, it's a small world even in those days.
Do you have any, we're involved in a development process on Isle Madame right now. We're trying to revive the economy and the social structure of the island and so on. Do you have any advice?
Well, I guess my thoughts are getting too rusty now, and too old to have many ideas. I find it hard to know what's even going on today. Things are so busy. Tell you the truth, the main thing that's wanted now is we'd like to have more rooms for elderly people at the centre. That's one of the main, and of course get our schools in order again. And I understand that's underway, and I understand we're going to have this French university, which I think is a great thing. So we really have a lot coming to us right now that I think of it.
I want to get the casing above the stairway. Yeah.
You don't need the doctor. Those stairs. He said, well, a nice set of stairs. You know where you get the next set of stairs? I guess at the Winter's office. But he said, the doctor said to me, he said it might be the best thing